If the lodge by day had seemed brooding in an air of ominousness, by night it seemed surcharged with menace. Moreover, events began to take place, disarming and insidious suddenness. Beginning in mid-evening, when Laird and I were sitting over those curious photostats sent out by Miskatonic University in lieu of the books and manuscripts themselves, which are far too valuable to remit out of their haven. The first manifestation was so simple that for some time neither of us noticed its strangeness. It was simply the sound in the trees as of rising wind, the growing song amid the pines. The night was warm, and all the windows of the lodge stood open. Laird commented on the wind, and went on giving voice to his perplexity regarding the fragments before us. Not until half an hour had gone by, and the sound of the wind had risen to the proportions of a gale, that it occurred to Laird that something was wrong, and he looked up, his eyes going from one window to another in growing apprehension. Then I, too, became aware. Despite the tumult of the wind, no draught of air had circulated in the room. Not one of the light curtains at the window was so much as trembling. With one simultaneous movement, both of us stepped out upon the broad veranda of the lodge. There was no wind, no breath of air stirring to touch our hands and faces. There was only the sound of the forest, and both of us looked up to where the pines were silhouetted against the star-swept heavens, expecting their tops would be bending before a high gale, but there was no movement whatever. The pines stood still, motionless, and the sound as of wind continued all around us. We stood on the veranda for half an hour, vainly attempting to determine the source of the sound, and then, as unobtrusively as it had begun, it stopped. The hour was now approaching midnight, and Laird prepared for bed. He had slept little the previous night, and we had agreed that I was to take the first watch until 4 in the morning. Neither of us said much about the sound of the pines, but what was said indicated a desire to believe that there was a natural explanation for the phenomenon. If we could establish a point of contact for understanding, it was inevitable, I suppose, that even in the face of all the curious facts which had come to our attention, there should still be an earnest wish to find a natural explanation. Well, natural is not always quite what we might expect to be natural. Certainly, the oldest fear and the greatest fear to which man is prey is fear of the unknown. Anything capable of rationalization and explanation cannot be feared, but it was growing hourly more patent that we were facing something which defied all known rationales and credos, but hinged on a system of belief that antedated even primitive man, and indeed, as scattered hints within the photostat pages from Miskatonic University suggested, antedated even Earth itself. And there was always that brooding terror, the ominous suggestion of menace from something far beyond the grasp of such a puny intelligence as man's. Thus it was with some trepidation that I prepared for my vigil. After Laird had gone to his room, which was at the head of the stairs, with the door opening upon a railed-in balcony, looking down into the lodge, room where I sat with the book by Lovecraft, reading here and there in its pages, I settled down to a kind of apprehensive waiting. It was not that I was afraid of what might take place, but rather that I was afraid that what took place might be beyond my understanding. However, as the minutes ticked past, I became engrossed in The Outsider and others, with its hellish suggestions of eon-old evil, of entities coexistent with all time and conterminous with all space, and began to understand, however vaguely, a relation between the writings of this fantastic and curious notes Professor Gardner had made. The most disturbing factor in his cognizance was the knowledge that Professor Gardner had made his notes independent of the book I now read, since it had arrived after his disappearance. Moreover, Though there were certain keys to what Gardner had written, the first material he had received from Miskatonic University, there was growing now a mass of evidence to indicate that the professor had access to some other source of information. What was that source? Could he have learned something from old Peter? Hardly likely. Could he have gone to Partier? It was not impossible that he had done so, though he had not imparted this information to Laird. Yet, it was not to be ruled out that he had made contact with still another source of which there was no hint among his notes. It was while I was engaged in this engrossing speculation that I became conscious of the music. It may actually have been sounding for some time before I heard it, but I do not think so. It was a curious melody that was being played, beginning as something lulling and harmonious, and then subtly becoming cacophonous and demoniac, rising in tempo. Though all the time coming as from a great distance, I listened to it with a growing astonishment. I was not at first aware of the sense of evil which fell upon me the moment I stepped outside and became cognizant that the music emanated from the depths of the dark forest. There, too, I was sharply conscious of its weirdness. The melody was unearthly, utterly bizarre and foreign, and the instruments which were being used seemed to be flutes, or certainly some variation of flutes. Up to that moment, there was no really alarming manifestation. That is, there was nothing but suggestiveness of the two events which had taken place to inspire fear. There was, in short, always a good possibility that there might be a natural explanation about the sound as of wind and that of music. But now, suddenly, there occurred something so utterly horrible, something so fraught with terror, that I was at once made prey to the most terrible fear known to man, a surging primitive horror of the unknown, a something from the outside. For if I had the doubts about the things suggested by Gardner's notes and the material accompanying them, I knew instinctively they were unfounded, for the sound that succeeded the strains of that unearthly music was of such a nature that it defied description. It defies it even now. It was simply a ghastly ululation, made by no beast known to man, and certainly by no man. It rose to an awful crescendo and fell away into a silence that was the more terrible for this soul-searing crying. It began with a two-note call, twice repeated, a frightful sound. Yignai, Yignai. And then became a triumphant, wailing cry that ululated out of the forest into the dark night like the hideous voice of the pit itself. Ya, 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 nug, ya. I stood for a moment, absolutely frozen to the veranda. I could not have uttered a sound if it had been necessary to save my life. The voice had ceased, but the trees still seemed to echo its frightful syllables. I heard Laird tumble from his bed. I heard him running down the stairs, calling my name, but I could not answer. He came out on the veranda and caught hold of my arm. Good God, what was that? Did you hear it? I heard enough. We stood waiting for it to sound again, but there was no repetition of it, nor was there a repetition of the music. We returned to the sitting room and waited there, neither of us able to sleep. But there was not another manifestation of any kind throughout the remainder of the night. The occurrences of that first night, more than anything else, decided our direction on the following day. For realizing that we were too ill-informed to cope with any understanding with what was taking place, Laird set the dictaphone for the second night, and we started out for Walsall and Professor Partier, planning to return on the following day. With forethought, Laird carried with him our copy of the notes Gardner had left, skeletal as they were. Professor Partier, at first reluctant to see us, admitted us finally to his study in the heart of the Wisconsin city and cleared books and papers from two chairs that we could sit down. Though he had the appearance of an old man, wore a long white beard, and the fringe of white hair straggled from under his black skull-cap. He was as agile as a young man. He was thin, his fingers were bony, his face gaunt, with deep black eyes, and his features were set in an expression that was one of profound cynicism, disdainful, almost contemptuous, and he made no effort to make us comfortable, beyond providing places for us to sit. He recognized Laird as Professor Gardner's secretary, said brusquely that he was a busy man preparing what would doubtless be his last book for his publishers, and he would be obliged to us if we would state the object of our visit as concisely as possible. "What do you know of Cthulhu?" said Laird bluntly. The professor's reaction was astonishing. From an old man whose entire attitude had been one of superiority and aloof disdain, he became instantly wary and alert. With exaggerated care, he put down the pencil he had been holding. His eyes never left Laird's face, and he leaned forward a little over his desk. "So," he said, "you come to me." He laughed then, a laugh which was like the cackling of some centenarian. "You come to me to ask about Cthulhu. Why?" Laird explained curtly that we were bent on discovering what had happened to Professor Gardner. He told as much as he thought necessary while the old man closed his eyes, picked up his pencil once more, and tapping gently with it, listened with marked care, prompting Laird from time to time. When he had finished, Professor Partier opened his eyes and looked from one to another of us with an expression that was not unlike one of pity mixed with pain. "So he mentioned me, did he? But I had no contact with him other than one telephone call." He pursed his lips. He had more reference to an earlier controversy than to his discoveries at Rick's Lake. "I would like now to give you a little advice. That is what we came for. Go away from that place and forget all about it." Laird shook his head in determination. Partier estimated him, his dark eyes challenging his decision. But Laird did not falter. He had embarked upon this venture, and he meant to see it through.